Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the SafetyNet webinar series. Today's session is presented by Steve Bruneau and Madeline Young of Polaris Aero, discussing how technology can make a difference in your safety program. I'm Catherine Hilst, and I am the ISBEO Operations Manager. As a globally recognized voluntary safety standard, ISBEO helps operators apply industry best practices by challenging them to review and compare their safety-related policies, processes, and procedures, and then make improvements, elevating them to the worldwide standard for business aviation. I have a few housekeeping items for you before we get going. All attendees are on mute, and you'll stay on mute throughout the presentation. But you do have a space to ask questions or share comments. There's a drop-down box that says questions. Please type your questions or comments in as they come up, and we'll look at those after the presentation. So excited to welcome back Polaris Aero. They are today talking about technology in your safety program. And a safety management system is not the software tool. Your organization can do the elements of SMS without having a specific software program. But safety SMS software technology helps to facilitate the safety program in a way that simplifies the effort by your team, enhances the management visibility into issues to focus on and resolve, and as a result, yields a safer operation. This webinar is focusing on the various benefits that technology can provide to your safety program. Steve Bruneau is the Vice President of Aviation Services at Polaris Aero, responsible for expanding the company's suite of safety management solutions. Prior to joining Polaris, he was the Chief Operating Officer of Pulsar Informatics, delivering fatigue risk management systems to aviation organizations of all FAR types, including maintenance and ground handling departments. He has over 25 years of process consulting experience helping organizations meet regulatory requirements or achieve new levels of performance. And Madeline Young is the product manager for Polaris Aero and is responsible for developing the focused product roadmap and ensuring the roadmap is aligned with customer needs, regulatory requirements, and the Polaris Aero vision. Madeline has served as both a safety and compliance specialist for private and governmental entities and holds a master's in aviation safety engineering. Very excited to have you guys back, and I will hand it over to you, Steve and
Madeline. Did we lose Catherine?
Uh-oh. Can you hear me?
I've got Catherine.
Can you hear? There you are. Go ahead. All yours.
Yep, I hear you now.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much. I missed the end of that, but again, we're excited to be with you guys today. Can you hear me?
I've got you, Steve.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. All right. Well, gotcha. Well, again, thank you for having us. We're excited. Let's jump right into it to avoid further delay. So again, what we want to cover today is how technology can really help your safety program. So just to kind of flesh out what the overall agenda is going to look like, we want to emphasize the importance of you understanding your why for your organization. Like, why do you have a safety program? Because why you use technology has to tie back to why you have a safety program, what you want to get from it. So we'll talk about that. Talk about the typical challenges and perceptions for safety programs as a way to address those things. We're going to talk about what you should strive for when you think about including technology. We're going to talk about the importance of people, process, and technology, because just plugging in some new technology is not going to solve world hunger. And then, of course, ease of use and access to all the different safety elements that a safety program entails is going to be covered. We also want to talk about system-to-system integration considerations. It's not just about a technology as it relates to SMS, but the technology as it integrates to the rest of your overall ecosystem. Then we want to cover a little bit around how automation helps with a safety program and touch on where AI fits into that spectrum as well. And then at the end of the day, circle back to the fact that this is really all about better decision making. That's why you have an SMS. So we want to make sure that that's always sort of the rudder in the water, keeping us moving straight, right? And then we'll wrap up for the day. So moving forward here, the why behind your safety program. At the end of the day, when you're putting in place a safety program or you're going to incorporate technology, you need to understand why. Why are we doing what we want to be able to do? And at the end of the day, the safety program is about managing safety to minimize risk. And we talk about risk in an aviation setting. We're talking about avoiding damage, talking about avoiding injury. We're talking about environment damage, or worse, reputation damage to your business, right? In the livelihood of the organization. But it goes beyond those obvious kinds of things, right? There's also accountability aspects, right? When you're working with your partnerships and your personnel, it's making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to be doing and getting the results that are expected so that you're delivering what you expect to deliver. And then more importantly, as a business, it's also about constant improvement, right? Building a world-class operation is not a once and done thing. It's something that's constantly evolving and looking to get better. So when you lock in the things that matter to you in your organization, those are the things that are going to drive the decision making going forward. So I think it's important just to kind of level set that before we get into the deeper discussion. The other thing that we really harp on a lot at Polaris Aero is that safety management is just another form of better business management, process optimization, and the like. So when you think about your own organization, no matter what you do, even outside the safety realm, anytime you see a problem, you try to fix it. If there's a billing problem with a customer, you try to fix it and avoid it happening again. If there's a problem with a vendor, you try to address it and avoid it happening again. And that might be just a business type process, but in reality, that's going to transcend in a very similar way to safety, which Madeline's going to cover in a few moments. But when you think about trying to solve any business problem you have, you're going to try to figure out, well, who was involved, what were they doing, where did this happen, when did it happen, why did it happen, and ultimately, what was the result of what transpired, because that's going to help drive, sort of the prioritization in many ways. So the point is that what you're seeing here is just something that you do now for business, no matter what you do, and safety is going to be very similar to this, which we're going to cover. So with that, I'll turn it over to Madeline to kind of, highlight that.
Right. To elaborate what Steve is saying here is one reason why the safety story is so critical is because data without context isn't helpful. And when we talk about data, we can talk about it in a technology form. We can also just talk about it as pieces of information that exist somewhere in our universe, in our operating universe, right? So we need to build that full picture of the safety story in order to understand what the right controls are or what controls are necessary to put into place in our organization. And now there are a lot of different ways where how you can determine what controls are effective. I have the hierarchy of controls method on the screen here, but let's use an example. Let's say FOCA data tells you that you have an unstable approach, right? So it's the data from the airplane telling you that you had an unstable approach, and that the trend is increasing at a particular airport. Okay, your risk assessment prior to that flight is going to add more context to those FOCA data reports. Is it all happening in the afternoon when there are gusty crosswinds that are more common? Is it happening when there are newer pilots involved in the flight? So armed with that story that's being informed by the risk assessment and the FOCA data, providing context from two different perspectives, you can then target which controls might be more effective for you to implement. So it's not just about telling the pilots to be careful. Maybe you can reschedule flights to not go into that airport in the afternoon. Maybe you can adjust your SOPs along those lines. Maybe you can implement more simulator training for crosswind preparedness at that particular airport, right? But you could also create advisories, ratings around risk to be presented to the crew when they're operating under those same conditions, because crosswind limitations in the afternoon at one airport might not just apply to that one particular airport, right? So what other factors, what other conditions might also be relevant to apply that same lesson to? However, the problem that you face with this sort of information is, how do we get it all in one place? How do we get it to the right people at the right time? How do we take those lessons learned, create risk controls that then feed back into our system to create a closed loop system? So technology obviously is a pretty key answer here, as we know, because of the conversation of the day. So how can we ensure, again, that those lessons learned are making it from our safety story through the risk control and safety risk management process and back into our system in an effective way, and effective being the key word there, right? Sure, you could communicate via email or in a briefing every quarter with your crew about things that you commonly encounter, but we have to remember that we're all humans, right? We all have memories that are powerful, but they're also fallible. They're subject to bias. They're subject to different modes of, thinking, or of analytical thinking or intuitive thinking, right? So there are all these things that play in our minds that control what information we're perceiving at any point in time. So it's not just about collecting the information, but also presenting it at an effective time for your operation. So on the next slide here, we have an example of taking one process and digitizing it. So the first process on the left-hand side there, let's take a pre-flight risk assessment. So your crew are doing a pre-flight risk assessment in advance of a trip. So they're looking at all of these different factors, right? They're looking at weather, fatigue, company rules, and they're accessing this information from a myriad of different sources, okay? They're manually researching that information, and then they're translating that into probably a pretty standard FRAT, right? So risk rating, qualitative values with quantitative metrics. And at the end of the day, we're asking ourselves, okay, did we miss anything? Is this really correct? Are we safe? Is this process of manual information extraction and synthesizing actually going to be effective for our mission, to make sure that we are aware of the right hazards at the right time for our mission, specific to, you know, whatever our schedule says that we're doing. So that's one option. The second option is a next generation risk assessment, where all of those data points, the AFM, weather, NOTAMs, your schedule, all of these things that are already tied to pieces of technology are working with your scheduling system. They're working with some sort of tool in order to provide you an assessment of the hazards that you need to be aware of. It's a much more proactive approach, and beyond that, it's automated, it's quicker, and it's giving you the right information at the right time in the right way, right, to your crew. So again, just one example of how technology can take a seemingly cumbersome and manual process and automate that and have so many more benefits than just the fact that it's making it easier for you, right? Just like I've explained. So right information in front of the right people at the right time, and a lot less subject to bias and the fallibility of our own memories and cognitive functions. Let's take a different example, okay? Let's take the process of taking information that we've gleaned from a safety report and getting that information back out to our crew. Now, one way to do that would just be to take that information in whatever form it exists, a paper copy of it, or, you know, a written document, and again, pushing it out via email or printing it out for a read and acknowledge book. So anytime you come into the facility, you're meant to acknowledge that you've seen that particular bulletin. I know of plenty of companies who are still doing this that way, and we'll talk about scalability of all this in just a minute. But let's look at it in terms of automation, right? Let's take that same process and let's use a tool that pushes that bulletin to your email. When you open your email, you're going to see the request to acknowledge your bulletin. When you click the link from that email, you're going to be taken into an application that allows you to read that bulletin or that lesson learned, and then further track that you've acknowledged that item. So here are a couple of benefits, right? Not only has that process been streamlined and you can get the information anytime and anywhere because it's been digitized, but it also exists in a way that's easily accessible to retrieve in the future at any point in time, right? And also, now there's oversight and accountability for acknowledgements of these pieces of information, right? So we can truthfully say that we know who is seeing what information and at what cadence, and that they're able to review that with time, and it can build a bigger picture of your culture as you start to accumulate the metrics of these sorts of acknowledgements, right? How proactive are we in acknowledging our risk assessments versus reactive in terms of waiting for an acknowledgement requirement to come and pass, and now you're overdue, right? So there are little metrics that you can glean from that type of acknowledgement behavior that can tell you how engaged your culture is, right? So again, just two different examples, right? That risk assessment process and the digitizing of just a very standard, simple, but really important paper process where you can leverage technology, not just for the sake of the end user, but also for the sake of metrics and oversight by the safety administrators and management in general. Steve?
So when you adopt any kind of technology, obviously it's not just a slam dunk. It's not like it just, you turn it on and it's going to work, and nor will it be accepted. So you have to think about your culture and so forth. And change is not always easy, right? You've probably all heard the book, Who Moved My Cheese, right? So when you think about implementing an SMS or taking SMS to another level, you typically hear things like, oh, that's a bunch of extra work that I don't want to do, right? Everyone's busy. Or, oh, that's prescriptive and it's going to force us to change everything we do. Or something you're going to hear things like, our team is comprised of a bunch of professionals. We don't need a safety program or safety system to help us do this. Or also those things like we do good things, good safety things already. And all of that's true. But at the end of the day, those things have limitations as well. Madeline mentioned the word scalability a few moments ago. That's a big part of it, right? Business aviation has a lot of turnover. So while your existing team might be super sharp, what do you do when you add the new person? Or what do you do when one of those super sharp people leaves? The organizational element of this is very important. So you need to address these things head on and make people understand that it's more about just a single dimensional problem. Taking it a step further, there's obviously, when you add the software component of it, people say, oh, that's a cost we can't afford. And a big thing that we like to emphasize, is that really a cost or is that an investment in further improvement, right? This is not like a sunk cost. When you invest in stock, you hope that the stock rises in price or you get some sort of dividend. When you invest in an SMS, you hope that that improves your business or avoids, negative cost implications like damage and injury. So the point of the cost, yes, it does have cost, but in essence, if you're looking at it as a cost, you'll never get out of that mindset. So you really need to think about it more as an investment towards improvement. And then for those who do have safety programs in place already, but maybe have used some of the older approaches to doing that, there are still challenges and perceptions there that you need to fight sometimes when you want to improve. Number one, maybe you have a paper process in today's modern age that gets problematic, for the workforce. Madeline kind of touched on that with the paper sign-off process as an example. But what about, you have safety officer who's a full-time pilot, maintainer, or something else in the organization, and they're just having a hard time keeping up with the safety program. So is your safety program being the best it can be? And then, of course, the pace of the operation can sometimes make it hard to be consistent and stay on task. Similarly, turnover, as I mentioned, could be problematic, and sometimes it feels like your safety program is going backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, where a safety program or a system can kind of help you weather those back and forths. The other thing that we see a lot of times with safety programs as a whole is that there's a lot of silos. So policies are in one place, training is somewhere else, safety reporting is in another system, audits are done somewhere else, correspondence via email and so forth. It just gets really hard to keep pace with, where is all the stuff that I need to do for my safety? And when you make it hard, people will find a million reasons why they don't want to participate, right? Or they don't participate as much as you'd like them to, is probably a better way to say it. Moving on, again, the team can only get to the system when they're on their computer, for example, right? We see that a lot of older technologies don't have the ability to give you ubiquitous access. And then, of course, management insights. One of the things that often happens is it takes a long time for the safety officer to develop those great bar charts and pie charts and all that stuff for the safety meetings. And the minute you print them out, they're obsolete because it took you like a week to put these slides together and something else may have happened. So you have to wonder about, making sure information is timely. And you really need to address those head on and blow those things up and really get beyond the single dimensional aspect of those. So when you do that, and again, tying it back to the organizational aspect, what should you strive for? At the end of the day, this is about lifting up the organization to a new level, right? So you want to, in order to do that, keep it simple, right? You do not want to overcomplicate safety. The other thing you want to do is you want to ensure that what you're doing is meaningful to everyone in their day job, right? As soon as people feel that what they're doing is something extra, again, it's going to get viewed unfavorably. So you got to figure out how to make it part of what they do already in a way that just adds value. And then last but not least is you got to make it seamless. And this is where technology is going to really go a long way to help you do that. So if you focus on these sort of three higher level pillars, then when you address technology providers or people helping you implement technology, you tie it back to these simple concepts and ask those questions. And if the answer is no, this isn't making it simpler, then you need to step back. One of the things, for those of you who have attended any of the Polaris Aero webinars in the past, we always talk about people, process, and technology. And we readily admit that just turning on our tools isn't going to just solve world hunger. You have to have good people and good process in concert with the technology. So let's look at that a little bit further. On the people side of things, no matter what you do from a technology, you still have to train them. You still have to make sure they're appropriately resourced. You got to make sure that they're engaged and empowered to participate and utilize this technology, and then leadership has to encourage it along the way as well. There will be resistance sometimes to new things, but if they understand why it's being implemented, then they can get over that resistance quicker, particularly if they're being led along by the right kind of leadership style. On the process side of things, right, we always talk about having complete and well-defined processes, making sure they're lean and bureaucratic and flexible, but making sure we're really focused on the results. And if the technology is not helping us do that, then that's problematic as well. And then again, on the technology side, as I said, simple, meaningful, and seamless is imperative. And to really get results, all three of these things need to be in lockstep with one another. You probably all worked at places where you had the greatest people and the greatest processes, but your technology was lagging. Or you had the best technology in the world and no one was trained. Everyone just recognizes that.
I can't hear Steve anymore.
Oh.
Catherine, can you hear Steve? Oh,
I think he just came back.
All right, guys.
okay.
Did you lose me for a while?
There he is.
Yeah, I think we lost you for just the last half there of that previous slide, Steve.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, move on.
we'll move on. All right, so I think what's also important to mention with people, process, technology, right, is that we don't need to think of it in terms of equilibrium across just balance, right? Balance doesn't mean equilibrium. So things are going to ebb and flow. You might have a really sophisticated technology and very few people to manage it and just the right amount of process, and those things are going to change. It's going to require refinement and awareness of that in order to move forward. And something that can help us define what those processes are to help connect the people with technology is to look further at all of the components of the SMS. Now, I can't pass up an opportunity to talk about the 4 components of an SMS. And so you can see them on the screen here. And if you're in this conversation, it's probably because you're already aware of what these are. But what's important to note is that each of these components allow for technology, they allow for automation, they don't require it, but we can see the benefit very clearly when you start to look deeper at the best practices around these. So in regard to regulation in particular, that is corresponding to those 4 components, what I often will just point people to is Annex 19, ICAO's Annex 19 for safety management, and the accompanying document of 9859, which is the safety management manual. I think the 4th edition is the current active version right now. Annex 19 is what's going to outline what the requirements are of your civil aviation authority to require safety management systems of their own people and entities under their control. And it's also going to provide what that framework is for those entities to work with, right? So specifically, Annex 19, Chapter 3 does state that so the Civil Aviation Authority shall require that the following service providers under their authority implement SMS, and that would include operators of airplanes or helicopters authorized to conduct international commercial air transportation in accordance with Annex 6, Part 1 or Part 3, Section 2, respectively, and training organizations, air traffic services, management organizations, type and design manufacturers, among a few others, right? I think mostly we're dealing with flight operations in this conversation. And then Annex 19, Chapter 4 outlines what those SMS requirements are for the service provider. So the SMS of a service provider shall be established in accordance with the framework of the elements contained in Appendix 2 of Annex 19 and be commensurate with the size of the service provider and the complexity of the aviation products or services that it provides. And those 2 things are so critical to this conversation. Up on the screen here, you'll see a snippet directly out of Annex 19, Appendix 2, the SMS framework. If you have never looked at that framework before, don't be turned off by it being, you know, this thing that's coming from ICAO. It is a 2-page framework for safety management systems that every civil aviation authority is required to base their own frameworks off of. Okay, so it's very straightforward. Here's, just the 4 components and the 12 elements that you can look at here that I'm sure you're all familiar with. And then, as I mentioned before, Doc 9859 is going to be that great manual to accompany how to implement SMS in accordance with this framework. One thing that you'll notice is not included in that framework is the word technology, okay? It's not there, but it's not there because we want all entities, again, to implement SMS to be, again, commensurate with the size of the service provider and the complexity of the services that it provides. You might be at a state where paper processes work for you for now because maybe you don't have the personnel to implement technology in the right way, okay? But we're hopeful that with that balancing of people, process, and technology takes more of an emphasis in that balance, and then you can work those people and processes around what the framework is that's being provided here. Okay, so again, just keep this in mind as an excellent reference for you, and understand that while, yes, we are a technology company, and yes, the conversation here is around driving you towards technology, we want you to just look at how you can better your system, and the natural conclusion to that will likely be advancements in technology, right? It will be consolidating all of these data points that you have in miscellaneous places on your intraweb and on the internet and in paper processes and documents into a single source of information where you can not only collect information, present information, but accumulate data and insights with time through interactions in real time via risk assessments, via safety reporting, via focal reporting, via any other type of information source that we can get into your safety management system, of which are defined by ICAO Annex 19, Appendix 2.
All right. Thanks, Malin. So when you think about SMS, I mean, everything that we're talking about here has implications throughout your organization, right? SMS touches a lot of things, but you shouldn't think of it as another silo. So when you look at it, SMS has implications across the spectrum. And when you think about the application of technology, how can the SMS type activities be woven into those environments that are all around the periphery here? It's important that people working in all these other parts of the organization see safety right in their face all the time as part of their daily task. Why is it important that they see safety information? This is important. So I'm showing a speedometer here, right? We drive our car. If we had a completely blank dashboard, that would be a totally different experience. When you have data, safety data specifically in the face of your workforce, that's going to drive safer action. It's also going to allow them to do personal self-correction. It's also going to have better decision-making implications. It's also going to help them be compliant. It's going to address consistency. And when you think about, again, workforce challenges in business aviation, these are all things that are hugely important, right? And then last but not least is quality, right? The quality of the work is dictated by the training and procedures that you have. But if they're not consistently following or being compliant with your procedures, then how can the quality be where it needs to be? So again, making sure that there's safety information in the face of your people is important for all these sorts of reasons. Taking it up a notch, transparency to the organization is equally important. Why? Because we're talking about culture. Culture breeds more success. Culture breeds a whole different environment, right? So when you're able to use an SMS system to visually show improvement, or more importantly, visually identify a problem and then correct it, then the organization is going to have a much better response to that kind of thing. So what I'm showing here on the screen is some FOQA data that demonstrated a group of pilots was not doing their flight control checks correctly. The data clearly showed that. They jumped on it and they did a pilot training session. And from the time of that training session forward, the problem was seemingly alleviated, right? That's a good safety thing. So the bottom line is when you have any kind of data that you can track and show people, and then more importantly, demonstrate the improvement, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? That goes a long way than just simply putting out a memo. So these are the things that technology can help you more visually articulate to your team, which ultimately leads to a better safety culture. So at the end of the day, when you think about doing your safety program, safety is about being safe. It's not about being compliant. And as Madeline alluded to on the slide or two back, technology helps this become a reality. So let's talk a little bit more specific now. So when you think about SMS at the heart of an operation and touching every part of your operation, where is that best served, right? Having a separate place to go or having a separate app or whatever those kinds of things might not always be the best solution. In our opinion, we think that having SMS embedded within all these other systems is the much better answer. So we want to try to find a way to make sure our technology weaves into the other systems. So let's think about that from a use case standpoint, right? Pilots, they want to see safety information right in their schedule and flight planning system. So do schedulers and dispatchers. Safety officers, you want to see your FOQA data in your SMS system, not have to go somewhere else. Maintenance, you want to see safety information in your maintenance systems, right? Everyone wants to get access to this data quickly and from any device, anytime. So mobile is a huge asset to be able to do that. But you need to be mindful that, just having another app and another place to go whenever, you got to be careful of app proliferation, right? Oftentimes we'll have 1,600 apps to go to get our work done. That's not good. So we got to find a way to make sure all this is done in the simplest possible way. And we also have to look at this organizationally, right? Why are we doing this? Because it's not just about solving the problem that happened yesterday. It's about institutionalizing a fix that precludes it from reoccurring, right? So when you think about the safety risk management process, by keeping safety reporting as simple and automated as possible, you're going to have a lot of data to act on. And then you need your safety team to be able to process that data through the full safety story that Madeline was alluding to a few moments back, to really get to the bottom of what's happening and why are these problems happening in the first place. And then you want your technology to help provide those sort of trend charts and graphs to bring to light the problems that need to be addressed. What comes from that, of course, is those new risk controls or corrective actions to make sure that these things don't continue to happen. But the problem is, if you do what's shown on the chart here and you simply add it to a book and put it on a shelf somewhere, it just becomes another thing that you hope your team can remember through the years. What we think technology can do is take that information and codify it into your risk control technologies. Those technologies are used pre-flight or pre-workday, so that your workforce is as informed as possible before they do the work, and that will allow them to act and work as safely as possible. If and when they finish their workday or their flight and there's something that can be enhanced or there's some additional problem, they want to put that back into this process to further refine it and make it better for the next time. If you're constantly doing this sort of closed loop process, what you've really developed is what we call a safety knowledge management engine. This is something that will get better and better through time and utilized by more and more of your staff throughout time. Whether it's people who work for you today, tomorrow, or 5 years from now, they're constantly tapping into the information that your safety program is uncovering. With that, let's make it more specific on the safety story, Madeline, to safety.
Yeah, absolutely, Steve. So data is everywhere, right? Data is scattered. It exists in a lot of different forms and in a lot of different places. Each one of these things that you're seeing on the screen here has a myriad of different points associated with it, some of which Steve was already showing on the previous slide, right? So when we take all of that information, how are we meant to do anything with it if it's all over the place? What do we have sophisticated enough processes or enough people to understand all of the information in all of its different places and bring it together? Or do we have a technology that we can use to leverage it, right? So data is everywhere. And if it can be completely meaningless until we give it meaning, until we can make sense of it. And if we're solely relying on our own cognitive computing power as the only machines involved in this, we're doing ourselves a disservice. Don't get me wrong, our brains, as I already mentioned, they're extremely powerful, and more brains are more powerful than one, but we're limited on resources. And they're also subject, like I said before, to different fast and slow thinking modes, right? They're subject to bias. And so when we can take all of the information that's scattered all over the place and leverage a piece of technology to bring it together for us, at that point, we're able to take action. We're able to accumulate meaningful insights and take action to mitigate risks, because otherwise we're going to miss something, right? Just by the nature of how our brains work and how much information exists. Now, something I want to touch on that Steve mentioned or alluded to as well is information overload. Right information at the right time in the right place is so important, because we are being inundated, not just with the different apps that we have to use, but with all of the different things that we're meant to care about. That our SOP book that's gotten so long because that's our primary method of risk controls, right? So how can we take our existing infrastructure and use technology to alleviate the stress on the individuals who are already in a high stress, high impact environment of operating on or with aircraft? So we all know that saying, you can't manage what you don't measure. It's a simple truth, packs a really big punch, especially when it comes to aviation safety. So there's this idea here that we're trying to communicate that it's not just data for data's sake. If we go to the next slide, you'll see an interesting representation of this, right? You'll see occurrences that have accumulated in this fictitious organization of a go around, a GIPWS event, a long landing, and an unstable approach, okay? There seems to be no trend at all to these occurrences, right? Seemingly no trend, just a bunch of random things that are happening, not much that we can do about it because, oh, they're all flukes, or they're all one-offs, or they're all anomalies. But we can be misperceiving that, or we could also not be trying to understand or going the next to greater lengths to understand the safety story, what's really happening. However, through causal analysis, we can reveal that actually all 4 of those events did have one thing in common, and that was fatigue. So now we go from not having a problem at all to, oh, now we have a fatigue problem. Maybe not a problem, but maybe just something to be aware of. But nonetheless, we're honing in on how we can actually improve our organization, as opposed to simply just looking at, oh, it appears we don't have any trend in unstable approaches, so we don't need to worry about that these days, right? It's not just about what happened, it's about why it happened, and the why it happened is going to help us get to those meaningful insights. Now let's take a different example. Let's say we have 4 unstable approaches, right? No, maybe an apparent trend here that we have an issue with unstable approaches. However, through causal analysis, we might understand that actually there's no apparent trend to the reason behind those unstable approaches. The outcome really has nothing to do with the causes. The causes are all different. Okay, so this allows us, again, to refine our perspective on where the issue is. Do we have an issue with unstable approaches? No, not really. This is where our issues are. This is where we should be focusing. And you need to get through that safety story to get there, but not just a safety story, right? You need a place to accumulate all of this information in one place in order to see those trends. And then to take it a step further and to take any causal analysis that can translate further into meaningful risk controls that can end up back at the right place at the right time in front of the right people. So taking that one step further, we can't talk about technology without talking about AI and automation. And so when we're talking about automation, we're talking about streamlining a process, and that can be done in a lot of different ways. And the primary way for us is through integrations and code, right? We can code things, we can develop algorithms, we can write very specific language that can perform some sort of action that we're wanting to do in the system. But that's different from AI. So what is really the difference? And I'm not here to actually make any claims as to what AI is. I'll let you do your own research on that, because there are a lot of different perspectives on this. But the reason that we're mentioning it is because technology right now, it's becoming very ubiquitous that AI is involved. And what's more important for you is not just to be necessarily wooed or impressed by the fact that such company has incorporated AI into their software, but rather, what does that actually mean? How does AI align with your goals? What are the pros and cons of integrating with AI? What are the risks of that versus what are the benefits of incorporating it? You might be relinquishing control, but you might be gaining some more interesting insights because of something that you don't have the time or the space or the resources to do, such as data processing. And finally, consider people, process, and technology in harmony, right? We've stressed this a little bit already, but people, process, and technology, when it all comes together, it means that technology is there to help you do things more effectively and more efficiently. When you incorporate AI and automation, it can definitely have benefits, but keep in mind how that is going to change how people interact with the system, how your processes might be required to change, and what considerations you might need to have of other technologies that are integrated into, for example, your safety management system. Steve?
All right, so let's look at a real example, sort of in a flight deck kind of way. So let's say you had a long landing in a near runway excursion, right? You want to have that simply reported into your SMS as quickly and effectively as possible so that it gets reported. And then if you have FOCA on your aircraft, you want that to be lifted off your aircraft as quickly as possible too, so that it can inform your safety program. Both of those kinds of data points in your SMS give your SMS or your FOCA gatekeeper the ability to very quickly get into the investigation stage. So when this data gets submitted to your SMS, your safety team is going to be alerted to this, and they can start to dig in to do the investigation. But these reports are really just defining what happened. The real vital thing, as Madeline was showing you on a slide or two back, was determining why it happened. And when you do the root cause analysis and investigation, it's all about understanding all the different dimensions that can come into play. Internal factors as well as external factors can sometimes all have a hand in the outcomes, right? So when you thoroughly do this and you document it in the data model of an SMS, what ultimately should bubble out are those typical types of hazards that are plaguing your flight department. In this example, after the investigation, if we found there was elevated fatigue, the pilot hadn't been to the airport in some period of time, it was procedural noncompliance, nighttime landing, mountainous airport, what you see on the screen here is a Swiss cheese model, right? Those 5 things on the right lined up, and as a result, the outcome on the left resulted, right? So the holy grail of safety is to be able to look for these sorts of problems on future flights, and if they're present, appropriately warn the crew of how to cope with them. That's the purpose of a risk control. So when you do this kind of analysis, it's all for the purpose of getting to the point where we can hopefully address these things in the future. The challenge, though, is traditional methods simply take these new risk controls, communicate them to the team however you do it through your ops manual or training, and you hope people remember it. And the problem is your ops manual becomes pretty voluminous over time. And as a management organization, you have to worry about, number 1, did they read the new manual? That's where read and acknowledge becomes so important. Number 2, do they understand what's involved in the change? And number 3, and most importantly from a safety standpoint, is if and when a future flight has those same hazard conditions, will they remember what the ops manual says to do about it? Science has already demonstrated that if you don't use it, you lose it, right? If you're trained in something and you don't encounter that something for some period of time, your ability to recollect how to cope with that is going to be compromised. That's just reality. We're all human. We can't remember everything. So we think that technology can help close this gap. What we want to do is use technology to raise the awareness of the crews to all the critical information they need to know about today's flight conditions so that they venture off with the most safe methodology that they can. And when technology is utilized the right way, it can look for all those things pertinent to today's flight, and then based on what it finds on today's flight, curate out the right kind of safety message to inform the crew in the most unobtrusive way possible, right? The goal here isn't just to bludgeon the crews with, hey, go read the ops manual. It's no, this specific section of the ops manual is pertinent today. So again, you're being very specific with your information, and the information that you present is the things that you learn from your safety program. So what do I do with this? Now, in a flight scheduling system, or in a flight, we'll call it a flight, booking a new flight, your scheduling system can be analyzed, right? It can then look at all the things around this gear icon to see if those things are present on the flight in question, run it through the rules engine to see what combinations of things exist. And if a particular flight has these problems, then it will curate out the right kind of message. So when you do this sort of thing, what you're doing is closing the loop on your safety know-how, right? You're being proactive with your safety knowledge. And most important, you're never forgetting a lesson learned. That message will be there for the crews today. It'll be there for the crews that fly for you next year. These are the things that you hope you never lose. So with that, Madeline, let's talk about the keys to implementing technology.
Right, so exactly what Steve was showing is I think that's the ideal state of where we want to be. How can we leverage all of these pieces of information to get us that information at the right time? At the end of the day, that's that's one of the goals here, is preparedness for our operations. So finding the right technology is one thing, but it's a very personal journey, right? Where are you at in your company on that safety journey? And look at it from a different perspective. Where are you at on your business journey? How well are you functioning as an operation? Are you able to handle a change right now? Do you have the resources and the people in place to help you, or do you need to outsource some of that, or do you need to leverage maybe a technology provider to assist you with that? Those are all questions that you're going to want to work through. Are you starting from scratch, right? Or are you going to have to take a pre-existing technology system that isn't working for you because it's not advanced for where you're at, you've outgrown it, and now you have to migrate to a new one, right? There are a lot of factors to consider here. So at the end of the day, what we're actually talking about, the main key to implementing technology is doing proper change management. As I said before with the Annex 19 Appendix 2 standard and framework for SMS, the process that we're talking about here starts with that framework, and change management is a very core component of that. So let's talk through what questions that you should be asking. Which procedures and people or roles are going to be affected, and are they updated? What other systems are affected and or need to be integrated? Has that been tested? Is it something new, right? Let's talk about a scheduling software. How do you get your NOTAMs? Where do you do your flight planning? You know, what other pieces of information do you have sources for that you would want to include in a singular piece of technology, right? Focal reports, another good example. Does everyone have the right equipment? A phone, a tablet, etc. And is it configured, and is it ready? How much of that work should you consider alleviating from your crew or whoever else who are involved in the process? Is everyone trained? Do they know how to get help or get information to utilize the new pieces of technology? Now, what Steve said is something that's really important. Getting the information into the system that the end user is comfortable with is so important. Yes, it'd be great to have everybody try to go to the same user interface on a website or an app or something, but we know that that's probably not going to happen because they're living elsewhere. So is that information readily accessible in the systems that they need to be utilizing? And what other parts of the business could be affected, and have we evaluated and prepared ourselves for that cutover? So moving on, I'd like to wrap up with some key takeaways, and then we'll have about 10 minutes or so to answer some questions. So the first key takeaway, and I will emphasize this time and time again, utilize that ICAO framework, utilize change management to prepare for success. Second is ensure that your team can get to the SMS from anywhere at any time on any device. Remember that paper process is completely fine if you all live and breathe in the hangar and in the flight planning room that's right off the hangar, and you're always there and you're, you know, always in front of that information, right? But the reality is that's not the case for all of us, particularly crew who are on the road, and any of us who have any sort of remote work or have jobs that are scattered, you know, in a variety of places, right? So accessibility to that information is going to be that next important item. Weaving safety into your daily workflow is just encapsulating this idea that we've talked about already time and time again. Safety management is not its own entity, it's not its own idea, it's not its own concept that exists over here to the side of your operations. It is a part of your operations. It is best business practices. It is efficiency in how you go about your daily work. So weaving safety into your daily workflow should come natural to that extent. Integrate with other critical business systems for scalability and avoidance of redundancy. Okay, so for this, we're talking about, again, we aren't trying to replicate a scheduling system in our software. We don't need two scheduling systems, right, to get risk. We need one scheduling system to inform a different system that needs that scheduling data. So how can you ensure that you're not creating redundancies in terms of workload for your end users? And then rely on automation, right, to speed up that decision making, to provide management insights, and to increase efficiency, right? Simple, meaningful, seamless are the way to go when it comes to determining what that technology should look like for your organization. Scalability will be important. We know not everybody is going to jump to the highest level of the highest platform that you can find immediately, right? So you need to keep in mind where you're currently at, but don't be afraid to reach beyond where you're at just a little bit, to push yourself, to push your company, to modernize what you have going on in your best business practices right now. So with that, you have a QR code there on your screen, which will take you to a little bit more information about Polaris. And I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions.
We do. Thank you, Madeline. Thank you, Steve. And I love the QR code at the end after your discussion of making it easily accessible. It seems like QR codes is the key to the kingdom anymore. Some questions have come in, and one of them, there's two that are kind of related, that are both absolutely related to small operators. So I'll just put them both out there. You both mentioned scalability in your presentation. How can a single aircraft small flight department benefit most from the application of these technologies? And then the other question is, what if small operators don't have a lot of safety reports, right? There's not a lot of data there. So what would they do? So two questions, benefit from technologies, and what about quantity of data?
Sure, I'll take a first stab at that. I think what's important to remember is that safety reports, it's very easy for us to think about this as something went wrong, now we've got to submit a report about what went wrong, and that's not necessarily exactly what we're talking about. What we're talking about is just an understanding of what's happening in the organization and feeding that back into the system, and that could be in the form of a safety report, right? At the end of the day, a tool like ours, right, it can be the understanding of what's going on in your organization can be provoked by a safety report. It could be provoked by focal reports. If you don't have either of those, it can be provoked even by conversation, right? We still have ways of capturing information and doing this sort of causal analysis or risk management to just understand what's happening. Okay, and yes, it helps us keep track of that for record keeping sake, because that is a core requirement for so many civil aviation authorities, for those of you who are required to implement SMS. So that's something to keep in mind. But on the small operator side, keep in mind as well that it's just as much about your own ability to remember information and remember the experiences that you have. That condition doesn't change regardless of if you're a two-man. That information that you're understanding isn't going to stay with you, like Steve said, unless you're using it, unless you're revisiting it constantly. So let's not rely on our memories or rely on our notepads or notebooks or emails or conversations that we've had to provide risk controls at the appropriate time in the appropriate way, right? Because that's going to rely on a piece of your memory that's not necessarily going to be reliable in the long term. So how can you get that information? Those lessons learned that we talked about can just be from a debrief that you've had with your crew. How can you get that information back into a system that presents the information to you at the right time under the right conditions, right? I don't need to remember about crosswind landings in the afternoon in Lincoln, Nebraska, because that's not a really big issue here. But maybe down on the coast, it is. So maybe on the coastal cities, that's when I need to care. Might not be something that I remember if I'm not traveling to the coast too often. So to get that information into a system that can provide it to you at the right time is really what we're talking about for small operators.
I think
Steve,
it's also,
any more to add on that?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that safety reporting isn't for just when the bad stuff happens, right? You want to report when there's near misses. You want to report when there's ways you can improve, right? So I think when you think about it in a broad business context, having all three dimensions of reporting, when something goes bad, when something didn't go as well as it could have, or when there's a better way to do something, you'll be surprised how much more information you'll get from your team. Why is that important? Because when the team starts to see that the organization is using this information to, in fact, improve, then you're going to get a lot more ideas than you ever envisioned, because people are going to start to want to contribute and kind of make a better workplace for themselves and their cohorts. So what you report is critical, and that's something that leadership has to work on the culture.
And that's stuff that you're already doing in conversations, right? If you're a two-man group and you don't have a software that you're using and you're having a conversation, as far as the requirements go, you're having a report at that moment. So when we talk about reports, yes, there is a actual interface and a way to do that with technology, but the information that goes in there is no different than the conversation that you would be having with that crew to debrief, to talk about those things. Again, what went wrong, what could have gone better, et cetera.
All right, thank you. So Another question that came here, and I think this might be applicable to pretty much everyone, is as you're doing this choosing technology, what factors should an organization prioritize to ensure that the technology they choose has the greatest impact and adoption within the organization?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things, again, going back to our takeaways, right? The first thing that you'll want to consider is accessibility of that tool. Are you going to be able to reliably use that tool all over the world, when you're in the air, when you're on the ground, on your phone, on a computer, and able to do all the same things that you should be able to do? So that's the first thing, is accessibility to the technology is going to be important. The second piece to that, again, is integrations, right? If you're adding a piece of technology, a piece of software to your ecosystem, and it doesn't integrate with anything else that you do, you are just creating another barrier to utilizing that system. And it's going to require a lot of willpower, a lot of repetition, in order to probably make effective use of that tool. So let's not have to go that route, and let's look at how it can integrate best with your scheduling software, with your flight planning provider, right? Those are the two most critical things that we'd be talking about in this case. Steve, more to add?
Yeah, I like to add it from the why perspective. Remember, we talked about why are we doing something. So, for example, if you're going to prioritize, let's say you have a handful of suggested things you want to do, and you're going to prioritize. There's a lot of things that go into that, right? What's the investment? How much time will it take? How many people are asking for this, right? Adoption is critical. So if I've got a maintenance department where on 4 different occasions, multiple people have asked for certain tooling that they think will make their life easier. And in another part of my organization, I had one report come in for some request that I think is important, and I kind of want to do it, but if we do this other thing first, I'm going to make my maintenance department super thrilled and move on. So that doesn't mean you just go do the maintenance thing because 4 people asked, but you have to weigh off all the different perspectives, right? Can I build my culture with this decision? Can I enhance my safety with this discussion? Am I going to improve things with my customers with this decision? Change management is important because you look at it from all the different dimensions. And then those are the dimensions upon which you make your prioritization, in my mind.
Fascinating. I think that also goes to another question here, that's just timeline for implementing an SMS software tool. And one of the takeaways I'm getting from you guys is trying to minimize barriers to usage. So what, along the lines of how you prioritize for your technology, is that going to, obviously this is going to affect the timeline. What are some of the timelines that you see depending on the tool for getting this in place?
Yeah, I
or is
think
that part of
obviously
your management of change? Right?
It is, of course, part of your MOC. Of course it is, and obviously there are so many factors that go into this, right? And you have to start with where are you currently at, right? If you don't have a software already, it's probably going to be a little bit more straightforward for you to move to a piece of technology in many aspects, right? Because you don't have something that you need to transfer information from and then to. So that's obviously one thing to consider. The next is size and scope of your organization and your own resources, right? If you are working with a current provider now and need to move to something new or want to move to something new, you have to consider the resources that go into educating yourself and setting up the software itself, right? So that could largely be dependent on the company that you're working with. How quickly can they build your system and then train you on that? Because that's going to be critical before you bring anybody onto the system, right? We don't want to bring people on and tell them to start submitting reports when you don't have the capacity or the understanding to handle reports. So some of that's going to be, right, dependent on the technology provider, and some of it on yourself in terms of your own resources. And then you have the rollout. What pieces do you want to roll out? At what cadence? Maybe your culture isn't at a place right now where it can handle even the concept of submitting safety reports to a new place. So you're just going to focus on the risk assessment piece because that's where you're going to drive the most value initially. So you can obviously see that the timeline can fluctuate here. With companies that come to us, we have a turnaround time to get them from, signed contract to fully functional of about 30 to 60 days, depending again on their timeline and their desire to get things up and running. And then we've seen rollouts take, as long as 6 months for the larger organizations that require more handholding.
All right. Thank you guys so much for this. I think we're at the end of our session. Just wonderful insights into using these technology tools and getting it easy for people to use and working through the changes. I want to let everyone know that the same topic is going to be offered in Portuguese and Spanish on Friday, November 1st. And then the next Polaris SafetyNet session is going to be on November 21st, recognizing and reducing risk in business aviation and flight crew maintenance. So thank you all for attending, and I hope that we see you at the next session.